Support for this podcast comes from Invent Together. I bet you didn't know that inventing activity by Black inventors peaked in 1899, and it has never recovered. Black and Hispanic college graduates patented half the rate of white college graduates. That's just one of the reasons why you need to know about Invent Together. When our patent system gets more diverse, our nation will get stronger and more successful. Find out how you can help diverse inventors and unleash economic opportunity at inventtogether.org.
Thank you for joining us for another podcast from the Commonwealth Club.
Hello, and welcome to today's virtual Commonwealth Club program. My name is Atul Gawande. I'm a surgeon at Brigham and Women's Hospital here in Boston. I'm also a professor at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health and Harvard Medical School. And as the club continues to host virtual events, they're also grateful for the continued support of their members and donors. Visit commonwealthclub.org to learn more about membership or to support the club right now with a tax-deductible gift by clicking the donate button on your screen. It is my pleasure today to welcome Andy Slavitt. Andy is the host of the In the Bubble podcast and most recently was President Biden's White House senior advisor dealing with our COVID response. He has led many of the nation's most important healthcare initiatives, serving as President Obama's head of Medicare and Medicaid, and overseeing the implementation and defense of the Affordable Care Act. In his new book, Preventable, the inside story of how leadership failures, politics, and selfishness doomed the U.S. coronavirus response, Andy offers a behind-the-scenes account of how the pandemic unfolded and what can be done to mitigate the next health crisis. Just a reminder as we go along, if you end up with a question for our guest, please submit those in the chat. Andy, welcome. Where are we reaching you today?
I am home now. I am home in California where my wife and I moved as we're now empty nesters.
And there are two parts of California. You're in Southern California, isn't there?
The official southern part of California, yes.
Where I wanted to start is I've gotten to know you for a long time now, and you're just so damn interesting. And you've navigated almost every part of healthcare, and there's a puzzle of, who are you anyway? And this is, you're a Ivy League trained guy who went to McKinsey, to Goldman Sachs, became an insurance executive, grew Optum into a major force, then your dive into government was to rescue healthcare.gov. You became a critic of some of the for-profit industry in healthcare. You was, as I mentioned, administrator of Medicare and Medicaid. You came out, you've started a venture capital fund for startups seeking to change the way we practice medicine or deliver medicine. You've been a policy fixer all along the way. You're a Twitter maniac with an incredible following. And I find one of the most informative feeds there is on keeping up with what's going on, especially during the height of the pandemic. And then you were a COVID deputy in the White House. So who are you? What has been motivating you? Is there a thread that can possibly connect all of that?
Well, it's kind of a funny question coming from a surgeon, author, the premier chronicler of the U.S. healthcare system, and I could go on and on about all the other things you do. So, the who am I question is I could go right back at you, Atul, with that. I guess I've always felt that if you're going to be in healthcare and you're not taking care of patients, you better damn well be helping the people who take care of patients take care of them better, or you're just overhead. And I'm not a doctor. No one would want to come see me for their medical care or medical advice. So I have a big burden to play because all those things you described are just basically overhead unless I'm productive and getting stuff done. So, the thing that most warms me if people think of me this way is as a helper, and it's in the Fred Rogers frame of look for the helpers when things are tough, show up when things are tough, and lend a hand. And that's what motivates me, and that's what I love to do. I got into healthcare not because I wanted to, but because when I was 31, my roommate from college had numbness. Who was a doctor, and it was in healthcare. Had numbness in his arm. 2 1-year-old babies, and he died of a brain tumor a few months later. And it wrecked his widow, who came to live with us. And that springboarded me onto a series of things, which led me to say, I just want to make healthcare better for people. And from whatever privileged position I sit in, I've gotten to work on some really big problems, as you said.
Well, you've made the choice at multiple junctures to go for very big projects and decide to tackle them through, with a lot of different tools. This time, the tool you decided to pick up was a pen, and to write this book, and to put a lot of time into writing a really well-written, gripping, kind of juicy book with lots of behind-the-scenes stories. Why did you decide that is what you needed to do when you did it?
Therapy, basically. How this is when, I picked up the phone. I've sort of become a pick up the phone person if I see a problem, right? So it kind of went like this. Donald Trump said he was going to open up the country on Easter Sunday when the virus was raging. And I considered that to be a kind of a mass death event. And we end up in the book referring to it as the Easter Sunday Massacre. And I wanted to prevent that. And I thought it was nonsensical, as did a lot of people, because I thought it was the exact wrong time to put a bunch of older people elbow to elbow inside a room and have them sing. So I called Jared Kushner, who I didn't know, but we knew of each other. And he was gracious enough to take my call. And so began an ongoing dialogue with him and others in the White House as I watched everything unfold. And so his story, my verbatim interactions with him, with Deborah Birx, and the kind of arc of the last year felt like things that should get out. But I also tell the story of a guy named Ahmed Aden, who's not as famous as Jared Kushner, but he works in an Amazon warehouse. And he got COVID and had the quadruple pleasure of getting sick, having to lose pay from Amazon, not being able to afford health care, not being able to get access to a test, lived in a 2-bedroom apartment. His wife and his 5 kids who lived with him had to move into the other bedroom. And unfortunately, there were millions of people like Ahmed Aden, and that story wasn't well told either. And I felt telling his story and telling these stories together that smart people would pick up the book, read it, and get a real sense for what the issues were without me having hit them over the head with it. That was my hope.
It's an unusual book because, in a sense, it's a piece of journalism because you're telling these stories of many actors from this warehouse worker to Jared Kushner. But the interesting thing is it's not a journalism story because every story you tell is of people that you actually were trying to help, whether it was reaching out to help Jared Kushner or reaching out to help a friend or a warehouse worker or whomever, and you're just trying to connect the dots for lots of people. And I think in some way, all of us were trying to help somebody along the way in this. This is a book that really excoriates Trump. I said you could have called it outrageous and not just preventable because I was, reliving a sense of just disbelief and sometimes outrage as I was going through it. But I wonder if there's an episode for you that is emblematic of what you felt to be a leadership failure that we went through last year, or a scene from the book, because there are many, but there might be some that represent the larger picture.
Right. So let's be clear what we're talking about when we say preventable. The pandemic wasn't preventable by the United States. Donald Trump didn't cause it. I'm also very forgiving of honest mistakes. Mistakes where people are operating with the best information they have at the time in the fog of war, that are performing their job with empathy and passion and commitment. I am very generous, and we should all be generous about those kinds of mistakes. But I'm not forgiving of mistakes that are made because of ill intent and that are what I would consider to be more of the dishonest variety. And Trump made several of those that we know of that cost lives. And I think it's important from a standpoint of accountability that we have that conversation. Now, I would say that this was not the only cause. There were many other issues that went on, but Trump's leadership in specific, for one, of course, we know he denied the existence of the virus. And his power to deny reality and try to get his followers to deny reality is something that he's hung on for a long, long time. And I think he thought by doing that, he could alter the way people looked at the virus. And the reality is, if he would have simply said in January, when he knew that, hey, guys, we have a problem here. We have a problem. Hundreds of thousands of people would have taken action and spared their own lives and the lives of their family members. The fact that he went to bed every night and went to sleep apparently like soundly between then and the time that the NBA stopped their season, and that resulted in the stock market crash. But, the fact that that's what it took, tells us something that we would have been a lot better off. And from there, I think there were a number of incidents that I found in these conversations where, he quashed any kind of dissent. And when you have a scientific phenomenon going on that you can't observe with your naked eye, right? Asymmetric growth, asymmetric spread, exponential growth. Those are things that defy our ability to understand them. So we need scientists to help explain them. And when he basically said, look, if anybody is coming out with a different point of view than that this whole thing is overblown, they're going to be summarily silenced or fired. And there was one moment in the book where Alex Azar was going to go on Fox and Friends, and he planned to say the words, things are fine, but could change rapidly. Now, first of all, things were not fine. But the fact that he simply wanted to say, but could change rapidly, caused the White House to pull him from Fox and Friends and then forbid HHS from talking to the press or the public for 45 days. So just think about this. Like we're having a pandemic, and our Department of Health and Human Services is forbidden from the White House from talking to us. Those are the kinds of things that are above and beyond kind of honest mistakes.
I remember talking to a North Dakota public health director in mine at North Dakota as they were going through this, and she talked about how she'd been in that role for 2 decades and said and had been through pandemic preparation for virtually every aspect of this. And she said, I was trained, I was ready, but except for one thing that I was not prepared for, which was that the public would be told that the pandemic does not exist, that this is not a problem. And dealing with a public that therefore was divided over whether this exists at all was not in the playbook that she was prepared for. What made that possible? Like, I never would have thought that attacking doctors and scientists about whether a problem exists or not would succeed. But then I would have said that attacking the NFL would have been even less likely to succeed, and President Trump was successful at doing that. What made it possible for, in other words, it's not just the force of this person. What made it possible for this to land and stick?
Right. I mean, my reading of Donald Trump is not that he comes up with these original ideas, but more that he's a populist. He tests what plays well with his base. He tests through Twitter. He tests in his rallies. So there is something about our country, and I think this is where you're going, that makes us skeptical of expertise, that makes us more willing to take a cynical explanation. So if the easiest thing to do would be if we sat here now and decided to go look at any public official, Tony Fauci, anybody, and say, let's go find the thing sometimes when they were wrong. Now, you can do that in good faith and have a conversation, and Tony Fauci would say, yes, I said what I knew at the time, et cetera. But there's another phenomenon that goes on, which is when someone says, that expert doesn't know what they're talking about, therefore, I'm just as smart as they are. And that happened over and over and over again. And we were susceptible, not all of us, but we were susceptible to that kind of shenanigans in our response. And it's a deeper set issue, as are some of the other issues we saw, the gross inequality, the way race played out. I mean, almost everything that sort of ties up the fabric of this country, good and bad, we saw reflected in some respects in how this pandemic played out. And that's where, when part of, yes, why I wrote the book, I'm eager, not for the next pandemic, I'm eager for us to say, we learned some things about our country that we could fix today. We learned that there's so many kids that don't have internet at home. We learned that there's a lot of kids that don't eat lunch unless they go to school. Well, that was true before the pandemic. It was true during the pandemic. Now we get to decide whether it's going to be also true after the pandemic. And I don't think the moral of the story is let's prepare for the next pandemic. I think the moral of the story is someone's hitting us over the head, telling us, hey guys, there's something about your country that you can readily fix. And that's where I think we need to be focused.
It's interesting, Andy, healthcare has been in the middle of our politics now for well over a decade. First, and you could run against universal health coverage and Obamacare and the ACA. At this point, that's the Supreme Court has sort of taken that off the table. ACA is the law of the land, and it is every indication it will remain the law of the land, and it's no longer the thing to punch at. And instead, the interesting thing is that Tony Fauci, who is most single-handedly responsible for the creation of the vaccines that brought us out of this pandemic, is the single most popular attack point for anybody who wants to run as the next presidential candidate for the Republican Party. How is defiance of science and defiance of the public health response the defining feature of the next presidential candidate? I still have a hard time wrapping my mind around how that has become so powerful that it's more effective than anything else that candidates want to define themselves around.
So I try to tell this story in the most personal way I can. And so I don't try to wax eloquent because I don't think I'm smarter than the next bear about like public health. But I do tell the story. I mean, you think about, people in public health, they don't get paid what surgeons get paid. Pharma companies aren't giving him billions and millions of dollars to do research. They're not getting big grants. They're not focusing on the acute problem of the moment. So a guy like Trump comes along, and not just Trump, but and can say these people are irrelevant, and they get rusty, and they get underappreciated, and it's just sort of not the thing to do. And the people that who do it for a living are phenomenal people. They're passionate. It's a labor of love, and they're underappreciated. And then I make the comment that if you happen to sit next to one of them at a dinner party, and they tell you that there's a pandemic coming, your first thought is, okay, how do I get my seat changed? Because this person is crazy, and that's what they've had to put up with for a long, long time. So there's an endemic thing here. Now, the Tony Fauci thing is quite interesting because Tony, as I do, and as maybe many people who are following this are, and I just want to know, like, if you're gonna say fire Fauci, then just tell me. I want to answer 3 questions for me. Number 1, what were you doing on January 11th? Because Tony Fauci and his team were downloading the sequence of this virus. What were you doing on January 13th? Because on the 13th, they connected to Moderna, and Moderna began working on a vaccine. And what have you been doing in the last 2 decades when Tony Fauci in 2005, under, by the way, Democratic and Republican presidents alike, all of whom were supporters of science, said, let's put basic research dollars and a public-private partnership behind the mRNA platform. And, thank God for that foresight. So if you're going to fire Fauci, maybe you want to be accountable for what the heck you did to prevent this pandemic. And, Ron DeSantis is now saying, we vote for freedom over Fauciism. Now, I don't see Ron DeSantis. I don't see Ron DeSantis declining to use the mRNA vaccine that Fauci created. So, all of us ought to have, look, this is a very tense time in our history. Politics aside, we've all gotten ourselves wound around the axle and upset and angry and wanting to point fingers. And, the best thing we can do is be a little bit more generous and forgiving of the fact that we've come through a hard time, that we are fortunate to have some of the great people we've had on the wall, but they're not going to be perfect every time. And when they're not perfect, that means the burden falls to us as neighbors, as people who live in this country, to take care of one another and look out for one another. And that's and so there's messages in here for all of us, and finding fault and pointing fingers and all of that. We just need to examine, in my view, the things that happened, the good and the bad, and figure out how to become a better country as a result of it.
Well, in the course of the storytelling, it's so easy to focus on the leadership failure, but there was more. And one of the points you make is that that there are roots to our failure to have captured this virus early, to have been able to adopt basic mitigation strategies through the whole of 2020 that had roots that predated Trump. Can you talk a little bit about the ways in which we were all at fault?
Yeah. And look, I don't know that I want to say we're at fault, but I would say there's things where I have to look at myself and say, what can I do, and what can we all do differently? We defined as a country, more than half of the country as essential workers. So many of us, and look, there's a dirty little thing that people don't want to talk about. And I have a chapter called The Room Service Pandemic. There's a whole bunch of people who, myself included, don't want to say this because it's not polite, but the pandemic was not a major, major hardship for. Yes, we missed events. Both my kids missed their college graduations, one missed their high school graduation, all that stuff. But, I was home. I was safe. I could be home. I didn't get paid by the hour. I had enough savings to last through the pandemic. And then I could order Netflix and Amazon and et cetera. The problem in this room service pandemic is on the other side of Amazon and, DoorDash and everything else, there's people growing crops. There's people driving trucks. There's people working in meatpacking plants. There's people working in grocery stores. There are people delivering those meals every day, putting themselves at risk, like Ahmed Aiden, the guy in the Amazon warehouse. And often they're people of color, often they're lower income. And often we would more than gladly expose them to us not wearing a mask or weren't thoughtful about that. And I think there's this thing that went on where once people felt relatively safe, it became a little, once people were more assured of their own safety, it's a human impulse, we became a lot less focused on those big numbers of people. And at one point in the book, someone says to me, "Hey, Andy, I don't know anybody who's died of COVID-19. And it was almost like an accusation. And I wanted to say, you've never been to Albania. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But it's because we are the way our society is structured. And, there's a lot of talk about freedom. There's also an argument to be made for, what do we as a society owe one another? How do we help one another? Where are we willing to draw the line? And if someone says to us, hey, you can save people's lives by making small sacrifices, that's something that almost everybody I know would do in a heartbeat. And I think about it this way, I know your relatives, my grandmother came to this country in 1908. She lost 7 brothers and sisters. She lived through a 10-year depression and a 6-year world war. There were days, there were weeks, there were months when she didn't have hot food or hot coffee. And if I don't get my Starbucks dark roast in the morning, I can get cranky. Like if I went to Starbucks, they were like, sorry, we're out of coffee. I'd be like, what is going on here? So we are used to, as a society, getting what we want when we want it. And if I said to my grandmother, I can't wear a mask because it's for other people, she would have probably smacked me upside the head. So I don't say this to blame people for their response. I do think it's worth reflecting on how everything we've set up, how kids, school, race, people getting paid, people getting and losing health insurance as they lose their jobs, our attitude towards science, how all of those things played out and what we might want to do about them.
It's one thing I've come to think is that this virus was uniquely well designed to divide us, in the sense that 75% of the transmission was through people under the age of 50, and 93% of the deaths were in people over age 55. We needed the people who were least harmed to take the most action to save the people who were most harmed. And then you add on top of that the divisions by race, which meant that some communities were hit massively hard and saw most of the deaths, especially in the Black and Hispanic communities. And then you had other communities where they really saw the disease last and had the lowest levels of deaths, often in our most rural areas, although in the fall, those became the ones that were hit. And I wonder if you think that makes sense.
Very astute observation. I completely agree with it. And we're seeing the same thing now with vaccinations. If you just looked at people over 30, over 70% of Americans have been vaccinated. And if you look at people as they get older, it's even higher. We understand that. We understand why. If you look at people under 30, that is not the case. I think we're if you look under 25, 18 to 25, I don't think we're even at 50-50. So there is something that's in the book which says, and look, this is somewhat of a loose correlation, but the two types of countries that seem to do better at dealing with pandemics are, one, countries that have been through a public health crisis before. They just have the muscle memory. And two, countries that have a more egalitarian common good, first, which I measured by looking at just the differences between the top quartile and bottom quartile incomes. Those that have very wealthy and very poor, where it's harder to empathize with one another, did much, much worse on a death per capita basis. Brazil, the US, Russia did far worse than countries in East Asia or in Europe that had a much more egalitarian society. So, are there lessons in there for us? I think there might be.
Well, it's interesting. Your first factor, for sure, the fact that that East Asia saw MERS and saw SARS led to a much more rapid reaction by China, by Hong Kong, by Taiwan, by Singapore, by South Korea. Do you think that despite all of this division, that's us, when the next one hits?
I think we'll get better at some things. So we have we are no longer the wealthy nation that's on an island that feels like we're going to get protected from the world's problems. It was like when 9/11 hit us and we were no longer immune to terrorism. So I think there is some impact for that. I do think psychologically, though, there's an unanswered question, and I'd actually pose it to you to what you think. In my mind, it's whether this will go down in our memory as more like the crack epidemic or more like the opioid epidemic. And what I mean by that is, the crack epidemic happened with criminals and people who should be who were therefore put in jail, and we didn't have a lot of empathy, and we.
Yeah, our rhetoric was that these are criminals instead of these are hard-hit minority communities.
Exactly. Whereas the opioid epidemic, that happened to all of us. We felt like we were victims of this evil drug company, and we had empathy, and we started setting up treatment programs, and we started talking about addiction and mental illness because we felt like it happened to us. Now, whether you agree with that or not,
from the white perspective, yes.
But right, exactly. So if this goes down as the thing that happened to racial minorities and older people and then I think our policy response will be less forceful, less change, less empathy. If we feel like this happened to us and it shakes us to our roots, that might change us more. One way to tell is to look at the American Rescue Plan. There were two features in the American Rescue Plan: the child tax credit and additional subsidies for healthcare, that really are, in many respects, permanent type of answers to help people who are living in the edge with no safety net, and living in poverty and affected by this. And you can say, on the one hand, this is great because it passed. On the other hand, we all have to acknowledge the fact that it passed with a single party vote, and it only passed for a 2-year time frame. So if 2 years from now, or within the next 2 years, we come back on a bipartisan basis and say, whether it's that or things like that need to be a permanent part of our architecture, because those are the kinds of things that will help us, then I feel optimistic. But I don't know that I'm yet at the point where I can feel that optimism.
I'll just say to our audience that I'll be talking to Andy. I have a few more questions for about 10 more minutes. Please go ahead and ask any questions you like in the chat, and we'll welcome your contributions and chance to talk to Andy. Andy, I do see some glimmers of hope here. We missed the opportunity to contain the virus. We then missed the opportunity to test for it and to respond and snuff it out while it was small. Then we missed the opportunity to use masks to fully control it. But we didn't miss the opportunity with vaccines. It was perfectly possible that we could have been politically divided on vaccines, but instead GOP officials did not attack the vaccine, unlike masks. There is nonetheless that there is a divide with the most undervaccinated populations, interestingly, being people of color on the one hand and conservatives, especially rural conservatives, on the other. That means that we're talking about a nation where our overall vaccination rate for adults varies from 45% in parts of the country to 85% in other parts of the country. And yet we're not at war with one another about whether to vaccinate. So I see a glimmer of hope of that and a way that we can move forward over the next 6 months. What is that opportunity? Where can we learn a lesson from where we've been to help us close the gap in the next few months?
Yeah, well, I think we always do better when we make an effort to understand one another. And if we think of people and we put them in these buckets of pro-vaccination, anti-vax, or even vaccine hesitancy, I think we isolate people, we label them. And I think the right way to look at this is, for a lot of us, it took 6 minutes to decide whether we were going to get vaccinated. We knew we were going to get vaccinated. We had enough data, closeness to this, and understood for whatever reason. There's a number of people that maybe it's a 6-month decision. They want to see what happens to others. And by the way, these people are largely, almost entirely not anti-vaccine. They've taken the rest of their vaccines. So this one, maybe because it's new, or maybe they hear it may affect their fertility. But we got to respect their process. And I know that we have this sort of notion of, well, we can't because we've got to get to herd immunity. But if we take a step back and say, these are individuals that are putting things in their body. They're not going to do it for the collective good. They're going to do it if they think it's the right thing. Let's instead focus on respecting their process, letting them get reliable answers to their questions, because the track record of these vaccines is so good that you don't have to do a lot other than say, do your homework and talk to reliable people. Don't go on Facebook. Don't go on Facebook to figure out whether you should take the vaccine, because Facebook knows that you are not sure. And so they're going to serve you the wrong content. But talk to your doctor, talk to your pharmacist, and take a little bit of the pressure off of that timing. And I think that's one piece of it. There's another piece of it, which is that this is mostly in people who are under 25. And for them, I think this is just sort of not that important. It wasn't that important when there was a lot of COVID. Now that there's not a lot of COVID, it's really not important for them. They're not offended by someone putting a needle in their arm, but they're certainly not, it's not on the top 20 of things going on in their life. And they never felt it particularly at risk. Maybe they've had COVID. And so, that's really a function of time. And so, look, do I think eventually it will become routine for most Americans to be vaccinated from COVID-19? Yes, I do. I think it's a matter of time. I think we will get through a wave and we'll figure out where the level is for now. But I can tell you that nobody will be bullied from here on in into taking the vaccine.
Well, I think it's important to pull out a few threads from what you said there, because I actually see some significant hope. A lot of attention goes on the people who are the most actively against the vaccination. But you point out the biggest chunk of people are people who are not actively against the vaccination. It's just not that important for them. And then, recently there are some maps showing that significant parts of the country have to travel 15 to 30 minutes or more, the majority 15 minutes, even in suburbs and in cities. There are, young people would have to decide to book it, to travel, to handle the sign-up process and get vaccinated. And it suggests that if you can make it super easy, you're tripping over vaccine to get it, that if you're making it so people's questions are answered, because people really do have questions, and it's coming from a trusted party like your own doctor, or doctors and institutions you're familiar with, that we can get to a big chunk of the folks that are left, enough that we can really, get the rest of the way to closing this down. What would get in our way of being able to do those things? Or is it going to happen? Or is there more we have to do that's not happening?
Look, so I think there's going to be a couple of seminal events that'll push this forward. One of them is likely to be when FDA gives final approval of Pfizer and Moderna. I think there's an opportunity to say to people, look, you were on the fence, you wanted to see the evidence, so did the FDA, the jury's in, and this is an opportunity for you to be assured that the FDA, who's had your back this whole time, they pulled Johnson & Johnson from the market for a pause. So I think there may be another, I don't know, call it 5 to 10% of people. I think there are some seminal events in the fall where college students return. And I think, what might become common practice is rather than necessarily seeing vaccines mandated, you might see, we'd like you to get to consider being vaccinated, but if you don't, you're going to need to show a negative test, maybe 3 times a week. And maybe that place is only open at 6 a.m. to 6:30 and create a little friction. And, those things will kind of work over time. And then, I think the Delta variant, there has to be there has to be a threat to some extent. And, I'm not into making up threats. I think we ought to be vaccinated and be prepared in case the Delta variant becomes significant. Right now, thankfully, even though it will become dominant, it's still relatively small. But, those are the kinds of things that could push things forward as well. The fact that we have these solutions. And then I think it's worth talking about that in addition to vaccines, and a really good antiviral would be another game changer and super high priority. And I think, along with vaccinations and along with global vaccinations, is probably the third leg of the 3 most important things we could do right now.
Maybe you could add one more minute on the antiviral. What do you mean by having an antiviral solution for the future that's different from what we have now?
Well, so, we have some clinical trials going on right now. And by the way, I don't know how you conduct a clinical trial in COVID right now when you don't have enough cases. So it's a little worrisome. But much like Tamiflu, something that can be taken at when symptoms arise and pop up, that can arrest the virus, not something that you take in severe cases or taken intravenously or even subcutaneously, but an oral, a pill that you can take if you're feeling ill, and it squashes it. We just put aside $3.5 billion to do additional research on that. And, if we could say, you might get COVID-19, but if you do, there's an antiviral you can take, and that will really take care of your symptoms. And of course, your contagion level, that will be another great tool in the arsenal. And of course, not everybody can take the vaccine. So that's important for that reason as well.
That certainly would be the game changer, right? Especially if you have an oral pill that you can take, a Tamiflu-like treatment that could be a broad antiviral for coronaviruses, so might be effective against almost any variant. And you point out, there's been a major investment in that line of work. And so, a second round of almost a breakthrough like a vaccine for the next pandemic and this one. There are a number of questions that have come in on the chat. Let me start with a couple that, mine some territory from the book. One was, you really plot out how mask and mask wearing became our cultural divide and the ways in which leadership affected how that happened. The question that came in is, how did masks and mask wearing become the defining cultural divide of the last year?
So my read of this was some version of Trump watching TV or going to a rally. But we know actually that when he saw what was going on in Michigan and Minnesota, where there were people that were wearing MAGA hats and carrying signs about masks and saying it was against freedom, it was the day after he had allowed Deborah Birx to issue this grand reopening plan, which said, if you get through all these gates, you can reopen. And of course, nobody was through these gates. And he saw these placards, and he sent out two tweets, famously, all caps, one that said liberate Minnesota, one that said liberate Michigan. And that was basically his big wink to his supporters. And he's not going to listen to these pointy-headed scientists, and he was with them in spirit. And so, I think that, like any good populist, this wasn't his idea, but it played well. And you saw him, and he would play games with it. Like he would say, "Oh, I'm going to wear a mask. Oh, I'm going to kiss you." His way of sort of plausible deniability by sort of this kind of winking thing really exploited things. And I hadn't realized how different that was until I was talking with the chairman of the National Health System in England. And we were talking about how challenging things were in England, how challenging things were here. And he said, I said, is mask wearing in any way tied to political party in England? And he said, no. Well, why would it be? He said, look, people don't always love masks. We argue with them. People don't want to wear them. People argue how well they work, which one works best. But by God, if we had to deal with Labor's wearing them and Tories not, I don't even know how to handle that. So he goes, God bless you, man. I don't know how you even deal with that.
Yes, there is an opportunity when you latch on to the urge, embedded in the idea that the virus, for people under 50, you're asking them to do something to protect the 93% of deaths over 55. Telling people you don't have to sacrifice. It's made up. You don't have to go through this. It's a pain. And it's not a significant concern for you. And instead, you deserve your freedom. And then you tie that to a party where you don't have a contradiction. You don't have people contradicting. It seems like an important part of this was the fact that you did not have Republicans who have been long supporters of science speaking up to contradict this message.
Well, the occasions when they did, it was like, you remember when Redfield was in front of Congress at a hearing and he said, this is as important as a vaccine. And he lifted up a mask and people were like, whoa. So my sense of from that moment and other moments from talking to Birx extensively, which is in the book, is that, the people that chose to stay were either making a Faustian bargain that somehow things like life would be better with them there, but they had to play by his rules, at least on the surface. And so, called in front of Congress, Redfield could say that, but the guy was the head of the CDC. Why wasn't he saying that every day? Why was that the first time he said that?
Well, I mean, this is where it's the science belief and question. I remember in a very similar way when the hurricane was off the coast of, I guess it was Alabama towards Florida, and the president claimed that the picture of the hurricane was headed in one direction, and the agency behind forecasting, I forgot, NOAA, the leader was asked to redraw the maps or else remove them, and no one was willing to speak up to defend our weather maps. At a certain point, when the leader speaks up and people can't contradict, that feels like the dangerous point.
Yeah. You can't really Sharpie a pandemic for very long.
Another question that came in relating to the path of the infection was, how many younger people have been infected, and do a significant number of them suffer long-term side effects? Not side effects, long-term effects.
You're probably as familiar with the data on this as I am, and the data is not perfect. I will tell you, and I've been public about this with his permission, my 19-year-old is one of them. I think the numbers, I hear 10% or so have, after like 90 days or 6 months have continued symptoms. Zach had COVID in the fall, so I think we're well past 6 months, and he's still dealing with symptoms. And as a parent, I would advise you, if you have younger kids or teens certainly, and kids in their 20s, you don't want to deal with this. I mean, you just don't. There's no more helpless feeling than your kid asking you, "Hey, Dad, when am I going to get better?" And your go-to move is to be able to say when, or everything's gonna be fine. And when you can't, you realize that this uncertainty, all that it can cause your kid, and you want everything to be great. Now, he's going to be fine. He's not going to get in the way of living his life. But there's a lot of people who have it much worse, I'm sure, than he does.
Yeah, it's a very low percentage of young people who become seriously ill, but young people can become seriously ill, and we saw the development of MIS-C, the multi-inflammatory syndrome of children, which put hundreds of kids across the country, but not thousands and thousands, in ICUs, and is responsible for a few hundred deaths across the country, numbers that are significant. And then the longer term side effects increase as the ages go up and you get into the teenage years and the younger adults. And those side effects can be quite debilitating. There's a lot of hope that vaccination is proving to be a kind of treatment for those side effects as well. I hope Zach does better over time and is able to leave it completely behind him.
Yeah, thank you. And he's a big part of the book because he explains exponential math in ways that adults don't get it. And of course, he was on my podcast, and he's. But it's like his hands are purple and blue, and they're very, very cold. So there's something going on there. Is that going to prevent him from leading his life? No. Does that worry him? Yes. But that I think that would be very mild. I would expect that that's a 1 on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of what people have to deal with.
I think it's also an important thing that we're learning about these post-viral effects. I think we haven't talked about long flu, but there seems very likely to be a significant rate of long flu in younger people as well, with similar symptoms to these that are, an exuberant inflammatory response leading to a kind of disruption of all of your autonomic system controls, affecting your blood flow to your extremities, affecting dizziness and your ability to just feel really normal. And so there's a lot to learn that we'll unpack out of this pandemic that is significant beyond the pandemic as well. There are some questions about the immediate short term, and then other ones about the longer term from here, in the next pandemic, et cetera. I want to go to one that says, what do you say to people who say, I don't trust the vaccine because the CDC says it isn't 100% effective against catching COVID? No vaccine is 100% effective against catching what it protects you against, right? What do you say to the questions that people raise? Let's start with that one.
Well, so first of all, if I'm trying to talk someone into taking the vaccine, I already feel like I'm having the wrong conversation. But if I'm explaining to people, as I often do, one of the things, say, look, there's 7,000 people died of COVID in the last 10 days. And what they all have in common is none of them were vaccinated. And there's 13,000 people in the hospital right now with COVID, and 99% of them weren't vaccinated. So if you do get, it is possible that you'll get a breakthrough case of COVID after you're vaccinated. It's entirely possible because it's 90% effective. But when you have that case, it's going to be mild. And if you hadn't been vaccinated, that mild case would have very possibly been quite severe. So the vaccine, is doing its job. It's working. It is doing something to your immune system that is helping you fight it. And so I think having people with those sort of proper expectations of what they're experiencing and what they're doing, and then also just being very candid with people. If people say, "Are there side effects?" The answer is yes, there can be. You can feel kind of under the weather for a day. Give people the honest information, and I think that'll help the process of doing their homework.
Here's a question that asks, how did people like Jared Kushner feel about the denialism from President Trump and others? Are you at liberty to report? And perhaps you can broaden to those who you have been in touch with from the White House and the COVID task force from the Trump period, and what they feel about the leadership they saw.
Well, I tried to write every character exactly as I experienced them in a way, and none of them were the caricatures that I'd read about. They were all complex people. I can assure you, nobody I talked to was sitting around going, "I want people to die." They prefer, people didn't die. That's not, nobody was quite that evil. But what I found that Jared was willing to do things to help, so long as it didn't run into the category of adding accountability to his father-in-law. At the end of the day, he was a political operative for his boss. And, to some extent, we're all a reflection of our boss. I worked for a president in Biden who said to me quite clearly, "Don't worry about making me look good. Give the public the information they need." So my job was easy, right? I didn't have to do this performative stuff. What was interesting was, and as the person who ran the model for COVID-19 was never asked to run a model of a scenario of what happened if we tried to minimize deaths. And she was never even asked to run a model that would contemplate a scenario where the federal government had any ongoing role. So it wasn't even presented to Trump as an option, because people knew that Trump only wanted options that placed all the responsibility on the states. And Jared said to me, point blank, "Andy, this is brilliant. Trump's going to get credit for opening the economy, And when things go badly, if they do, then that's going to be on the governors, and they're going to get the blame, and he won't get any of the blame. Now, he was wrong about that. I don't think you can escape accountability, but that was the play they were running. And so if I would say to Jared, hey, Jared, we got to stop this Easter Sunday thing, and I could submit a plan to do it in a way that was politically favorable to the president, he was all ears. If I said, Jared, the federal government needs to take more responsibility for procuring testing and investing in testing and allocating testing to states, he said, no way, not going to happen. The governors are all against us. The governors want this to fail. They have no incentive if we do this, and they're going to put it back on the president. So it's all on them, and we're not going to do that. So ultimately, it was clear what was most important to them.
Two forward-looking questions to the next pandemic. First is, how do you think the U.S. will handle the next pandemic? Will we handle it well? Are you worried we will be more likely to overreact or underreact next time? And then there's a second one related to it, but I'll come back. Let's start with that one.
So we made a series of technical mistakes containing the virus. And I think, and we had a series of things we were completely unprepared for, not enough PPE, ventilators, et cetera. I'm going to assume we're going to do better at the technical stuff, but we may not be not every virus is containable, and it may not be so easy. And so we should expect when this comes back that we're not necessarily going to be rescued by science. We're not necessarily going to be rescued by the CDC. We're not going to, that we will have to carry some burden. And that's the part that I think is a big question mark, is if it does require behavior change on our part, whether it's wearing a mask or avoiding large crowds, will we be up for it? Will we do a better job than last time? I will tell you that one thing we have been working on, and we haven't talked a lot about it in the Biden administration, is, we think we can cut down the vaccination time even further from what we did this time, even as quick as 9 months. And that's because we can make investments today in all the various types of potential virus vaccines. We can create the manufacturing capacity today. We don't have to use it all. And it has a cost to the country that before today we weren't willing to pay for. We weren't willing to spend, and it's in the single billions of dollars. It's not in the trillions. It's not in the hundreds of billions. It's not even in the tens of billions, but it's in the singles of billions of dollars a year that would allow you to have, in effect, somewhat of an insurance policy to say within 9 months, you can have mass vaccination capability for any of the major viruses likely to hit the market. I think we believe that that's an expense the country will want to pay for and should want to pay for. And it also will create lots of jobs and will make us a vaccine arsenal for the globe. And so in that respect, I think we'll do well. But, we have that mushy part, as we know, which is that interim period where things are on us and our own behavior is going to dictate how this thing spreads. And that's the big question mark.
I think we're going to be down to our last question here. So I'm going to combine two of them and I think these are great questions. And one is, what is one specific administrative action the Biden team can take without legislation that would most prepare us for the next pandemic? And the other one is the sort of parallel. If there's one lesson or one thing you think the average American can do, can learn from last year to be prepared for the next, what would it be?
Those are great questions. And so since I've already talked about the manufacturing capacity and anticipating on the vaccines, I'll say that in addition, I think you and I would probably both agree that a first-class intelligence system to detect and monitor and sequence viruses as they occur is another essential ingredient, as well as a big investment in a public health workforce. Now, those are not necessarily things to be done by executive action, but the good news is that the American Rescue Plan gave us the money to do those things. So we got to do them. We got to do them well. We got to build up a public health workforce. We got to make that a career that people want to be in. It's a sexy career. I encourage you to encourage your kids to go into this. And And I encourage every company in the country to have a chief public health officer and to really make public health integrated into all of the things that we do, because it can't be just the government. It has to be government leading and people following. And, for us as individuals, it's a really tricky conversation. It's a really tricky question. But I would start with, I guess I'm going to say a couple things, and it's not directly on point. One is, if you've been vaccinated, in my opinion, the most important thing you can do right now is get back the parts of your life that you haven't gotten back, that you feel like you lost during the pandemic, that are still available to you, and take as much joy from those things that you lost, and try not, if you have deferred dreams, whatever it is, that's the most important thing you can do. If you're not vaccinated, you probably should consider getting vaccinated and then doing those things. But I don't think anybody should be obsessing over the Delta variant if they've been vaccinated. There are far greater threats in your life right now, and this is in the category of a manageable challenge. And then I think we've got some repair work to do, whether it's repairing relationships that got frayed during the pandemic, or whether it's sort of being more generous in our thinking about the different experiences that people had during the pandemic, where they lost things that may have been different from the things that you or I lost. And I think fixing the problems that occurred, that we saw, that the people lived through during the pandemic, if we fix those things now instead of waiting for the next pandemic, I think it'll do a lot of good. And then, of course, obviously buying my book, Preventable, and you can get a signed copy of that if you'd like. Just go to my Twitter account at @aslavit, and I'll tweet about it. But I think, I don't know how you make it through the next pandemic without the book.
Well, Andy, thank you for the book. Thank you for your first draft of a historical event that will be remembered for a long time, and I hope we all learn from, and you've helped us figure out how to learn from it. I want to thank you. I just want to thank you and tell you that my publisher pointed out the one mistake I made was, since you were kind enough to write a nice blurb for the book, I should have made your name in big font and my name in small font. Thank you, Andy. I encourage you to pick up Andy's book at your local bookstore. I'd also say that if you would like to watch more virtual programs or support the Commonwealth Club efforts, please visit commonwealthclub.org. I'm Atul Gawande. Thank you and take care. Thank you, Andy Slavitt and Commonwealth Club.
You've been listening to the Commonwealth Club of California. Hear thousands of our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Stitcher. If you like what you've heard, please consider supporting our work and help us bring 500 programs a year to listeners like you. Go to commonwealthclub.org/donate. Think your way around the world with our travel programs to exciting domestic and international destinations. And when you're in the Bay Area, please join us live at our events. Thank you for listening and for your support.